Okay, so you sent over this CBS News article about the helicopter crash
Yeah, oh, yeah.
near Reagan National Airport.
Mm,
And wow, what a story this is.
it's a tough one.
Yeah, we're going to do a deep dive into it today,
Mm,
breaking down the details and trying to make sense of this really perplexing incident.
yeah, it's a real tragedy we're talking about. A military Blackhawk helicopter colliding with a passenger plane, resulting in the worst air disaster in the U.S. in over a decade.
And right off the bat, there's this question, this big question mark
Mhm.
surrounding the helicopter's altitude. It was flying significantly higher than it was supposed to be.
Right.
In fact, the data shows it was cruising at around 400 feet, while the permitted ceiling in that area is only 200 feet.
That's right. And to understand the severity of this, you have to picture the airspace around a major airport like Reagan National. Imagine it's like a multi-layered highway in the sky
Mm.
with different lanes designated for different types of aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
The flight ceiling, in this case 200 feet, acts like a strict speed limit for that specific lane, ensuring safe separation between aircraft.
So exceeding that limit is kind of like speeding in a school zone, highly dangerous, and definitely raises some red flags.
Exactly. Especially considering we're talking about experienced military pilots who are usually very familiar with these regulations.
It makes you wonder, couldn't they have simply misjudged the altitude? Or could it have been an equipment malfunction?
Well, those are definitely possibilities. Investigators will be looking into Greg Faith, a former senior air safety investigator with the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB as it's commonly known,
Right.
has publicly questioned why the helicopter was flying so high. The NTSB is the agency responsible for investigating civil aviation accidents in the U.S.
So he's suggesting that this deviation from the permitted altitude was a deliberate decision.
He doesn't explicitly say that, but he does highlight the fact that these pilots are highly trained and familiar with the area, which makes the altitude discrepancy even more perplexing.
And it's not just him, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned other experts are also focusing on this altitude issue.
Absolutely. Stephen B. Wallace, former director of accident investigations for the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA.
Right.
The agency that regulates civil aviation in the U.S. has also stated that the helicopter's altitude will be a key focus for investigators. Even Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has confirmed that the investigation is examining this aspect.
Okay, so we've established that this altitude discrepancy is a major concern. Now let's dig a bit deeper into these near misses you mentioned earlier. You said there have been at least 9 reported near misses near Reagan National since 2005.
That's correct. And what's particularly striking is that 3 of those near misses also involved helicopters.
So this isn't an isolated incident. There seems to be a pattern emerging here. What can you tell us about these previous near misses? Did any of them involve similar altitude discrepancies?
Let's look at a particularly chilling example from 2015. A pilot reported a near midair collision that occurred at, guess what, 400 feet off the ground. And it happened on approach to runway 33, the same runway involved in this recent crash.
Wow, talk about a close call. 400 feet is hardly any distance when you're talking about 2 aircraft converging. And this happened on the same runway.
Exactly. And according to the pilot's report, they came so close to the other aircraft that the pilot monitoring had to take control to prevent a collision.
Oh, wow.
It just highlights how easily this could have turned into a disaster back then.
It's really disturbing to think that something similar could have happened 5 years ago. What were the circumstances surrounding that near miss? Was there any explanation given as to why the aircraft were so close?
Unfortunately, the specific details aren't publicly available, but the fact that it occurred at the same altitude as the helicopter in the recent crash is certainly a cause for concern.
It makes you wonder if any lessons were learned from that 2015 incident. Were there any changes made to procedures or regulations after that close call?
That's a question investigators will hopefully be able to answer, but the fact that we have another incident just 5 years later with eerily similar circumstances certainly raises some questions about whether enough was done to address potential safety gaps.
This runway 33 keeps coming up. Is there something specific about this runway that makes it more prone to these near misses?
That's a great question. Runway 33 is actually shorter than the other runways at Reagan National and is mainly used by smaller aircraft. This means pilots have to maintain lower altitudes for both takeoff and landing, which potentially increases the risk of coming into conflict with other aircraft, especially helicopters operating in the vicinity.
So it's almost like this particular runway creates a sort of bottleneck in the airspace, increasing the chances of an incident.
That's a good way to put it. And there's another incident from 2013 also involving a helicopter, and you guessed it, runway 33.
Oh, no.
A pilot had to abort their landing because they believed the helicopter was turning into their flight path. They estimated they came within a few hundred feet of each other.
That's way too close for comfort. It definitely seems like runway 33 has a history of close calls, especially when helicopters are involved.
Mm.
Are there any specific regulations or procedures in place regarding helicopter operations around this runway?
There are, of course, general regulations regarding helicopter operations near airports, but investigators will have to determine if those regulations are sufficient or if there are any specific procedures related to runway 33 that need to be reviewed and potentially revised.
So we've got this recurring issue with near misses on runway 33, and now this tragic crash that also involved a helicopter flying too high.
Hmm.
I'm really curious to hear what experts think might have caused the helicopter to deviate so significantly from the permitted altitude.
Right.
Do you think it was a deliberate decision, a case of misjudgment, or something else entirely?
That's where we'll delve into next. There are a number of potential explanations, and investigators will be meticulously examining all of them. It does, doesn't it? And that's what makes this whole thing so puzzling. Why was that helicopter flying so high?
Right. It's not like those pilots just said, forget the rules. There has to be some explanation.
Absolutely. And thankfully, we have those black boxes to help us figure things out.
I know they're important, but honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on what exactly those black boxes do.
Well, think of them like a flight recorder. It captures everything that happened on that flight.
Okay.
There are two parts. The cockpit voice recorder, which picks up everything the pilots say and any other sounds in the cockpit. And then there's the flight data recorder, which tracks things like altitude, speed, heading, even the positions of the controls.
So it's like having a super detailed log of every moment of the flight.
Exactly. And in this case, both the helicopters and the passenger planes recorders have been recovered, which is a huge help for the investigation.
That's good news for getting answers. But it still doesn't tell us why that helicopter was flying so high in the first place. Any ideas?
Well, there are a few theories floating around. And Greg Faith, the former NTSB investigator we talked about earlier, has pointed out some possibilities. One is that the helicopter's altimeter might have malfunctioned.
The altimeter. That's what tells the pilots how high they are, right?
Exactly. If it wasn't working properly, the pilots might have thought they were at the right altitude, even though they were way higher than they should have been.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't they have checked their altitude with other instruments or even with air traffic control?
Well, you would hope so. And that's something investigators will be looking into very carefully when they analyze all the data and communication logs. But even the most experienced pilots can be fooled by a faulty instrument, especially if the problem develops slowly during the flight.
That's true. Okay, so a faulty altimeter is one possibility. What else are they considering?
Another thing they're looking into is the wind conditions that day. Strong gusts can really push an aircraft around, especially a helicopter.
But aren't military pilots like experts at handling wind?
They are, but wind can be unpredictable, especially in a busy airspace like Reagan National.
Yeah, that's true.
A sudden gust or a shift in wind direction can push an aircraft off course or cause unexpected changes in altitude.
So even with all their training, strong winds could have made it hard for them to stay at their assigned altitude.
Exactly. It's all about being aware of what's happening around you and reacting quickly to any sudden changes. And there's one more thing that Faith mentioned, that investigators will be looking into the use of night vision goggles.
Night vision goggles. How could those have anything to do with the altitude?
It's not about the altitude itself, but more about how those goggles can affect a pilot's depth perception and spatial awareness. You see, night vision goggles can limit your peripheral vision and make it tougher to judge distances, especially in a complex environment like an airport.
Oh, so even though they're necessary for flying at night, they might have made it hard for the pilots to judge their position relative to other aircraft or the ground.
That's the thinking. Of course, military pilots are highly trained in using night vision goggles, but it's still something investigators have to consider.
Wow. It sounds like they have a lot to sift through. But hopefully with those black boxes, they can put together a clearer picture of what happened. It's just so tragic, especially considering what Faith said earlier. If the helicopter had been at its proper altitude, this collision probably wouldn't have happened at all.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? It just shows how important it is to follow those regulations and how even what seems like a small mistake can have devastating consequences.
This whole thing has really got me thinking about how complex air travel really is. We kind of take it for granted, but there are so many systems and procedures in place to keep everyone safe.
It's an amazing feat of engineering and human coordination when you think about it.
Yeah.
But like with any complex system, there are risks. And it's crucial to be aware of those risks and always work to minimize them.
Speaking of minimizing risks, is there anything that could have been done differently in this case? I mean, knowing what we know about those near misses at Reagan National, could things like increased awareness or stricter enforcement have made a difference?
That's the question everyone's asking. And it's one that aviation experts will be debating for a while.
Seems like there were warning signs, those near misses. You'd think that maybe something more could have been done.
I see what you mean. After any close call, the question should always be, what can we learn from this and how can we stop it from happening again? Maybe a more in-depth look at those previous near misses, along with tougher enforcement of altitude rules or even changes to flight paths, could have helped reduce the risks in that area.
It's hard not to think about whether this could have been prevented. But looking ahead, what can we, as passengers, do to help make flying even safer?
That's a great question. And it leads us to something really important about aviation safety. It's a shared responsibility. It's not just on the pilots and air traffic controllers. We all have a part to play.
Yeah, it's a shared responsibility, and it starts with us as passengers being more aware and informed.
So what can we do? Besides, not panicking when there's turbulence.
Well, for starters, we can all do a bit of research. Understand the basics of how air travel works, the roles of different agencies like the FAA and NTSB, and why it's so important to follow safety regulations.
So like reading up on things.
Exactly. The more we know about how everything works, the better we'll be at spotting potential problems and pushing for improvements.
Makes sense.
What else? And this is crucial. Take those See Something, Say Something campaigns seriously. If you notice anything unusual or concerning during your travels, don't hesitate to report it.
Like if you see a pilot who looks a little too sleepy or a piece of luggage that's suspiciously duct taped together. Well, maybe not those specific things. But you get the idea. Anything that seems out of the ordinary or raises a red flag about safety should be reported. It could be something as simple as a cracked window or a weird noise coming from the engine.
So basically, be observant and don't assume someone else will take care of it.
Exactly. We all need to feel empowered to speak up if something seems off. It's about creating a culture of safety where everyone is involved.
Like they say, it takes a village. In this case, it takes the whole airport, the entire airline industry, and all of us passengers working together.
Well said. And I think that brings us to the most important question we want to leave our listeners with today.
All right, so what's the big question?
Could this tragedy have been prevented? Could increased awareness of those near misses we talked about and stricter enforcement of those altitude rules have made a difference? It's a tough question, but it's one we all need to think about as we work towards safer skies.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep the conversation about aviation safety going because it's something that affects every single one of us. Thanks for listening.